At precisely 11:17 on a Thursday morning that had commenced indistinguishably from any other, Prince William's telephone sounded with a specific ringtone allocated exclusively for the highest priority palace correspondence, the sort of summons that occurs perhaps twice in an entire lifetime. It is the variety of call that instantly cleaves one's personal timeline into a distinct before and after. Within mere moments of accepting the connection, the color completely vanished from his visage. His hands, typically renowned for their steadiness, commenced an uncontrollable trembling. Then, in that singular juncture, positioned solitarily within his private study at Kensington Palace, while the winter sunlight poured through panes that suddenly appeared agonizingly brilliant, William absorbed intelligence so catastrophic that the very masonry seemed to take on the impact. The fracturing event originated from Sir Clive Alderton, King Charles's chief of staff, a figure celebrated for his unflappable demeanor even amidst the monarchy's most shadowy periods. However, on this specific day, his vocal quality bore a weight William had never previously detected. It was not precisely panic, yet it was uncomfortably adjacent to it, sounding both pressing and irrevocable. "Sir," he initiated the formal address, which felt significantly more burdensome than usual, "you must retreat to Windsor without delay. A situation has arisen, a critical one." William squandered no moments on interrogations. The inflection of the voice conveyed every necessary detail he required. Whatever event had transpired was far outside the realm of standard emergency protocol, exceeding the customary upheavals that characterized existence within the monarchy. He terminated the conversation, remained paralyzed for exactly 3 seconds, and then sprung into action with the specific intensity that stems from decades of rehearsing for scenarios one prays will never materialize. Catherine was located in the nursery when he finally reached her. She raised her eyes from assisting Charlotte with her studies, and the countenance William presented caused her to halt her sentence abruptly. She instinctively recognized that specific look. She had witnessed it merely once in the past, upon the passing of his grandmother. Without uttering a syllable, she stood up, pardoned herself from the children's presence, and trailed him into the corridor. "The situation is dire," William stated softly, his vocal cords scarcely maintaining stability. "They refused to elaborate via telephone, yet the severity is such that they are implementing a total communications blackout." Catherine's hand sought out his forearm, applying a reassuring, gentle pressure. She refrained from posing inquiries as well. Certain instances demand a hushed reverence rather than a barrage of interrogation. Within minutes, William's security detail had been fully appraised of the situation. A vehicle was already positioned in the courtyard, with the engine idling, prepared to complete the 20-minute journey to Windsor in half the standard duration. The household staff maneuvered through Kensington Palace with a practiced efficiency. However, even they detected a subtle shift in the atmosphere that day. The head housekeeper, who had attended to the Wales family for 15 years, later confided to associates that she experienced a shiver completely unrelated to the December climate. As William's vehicle accelerated away from Kensington Palace, moving at velocities typically restricted to genuine crises, communication teams across London were accepting encrypted directives. Lockdown protocols were immediately activated. All non-critical media interactions were suspended indefinitely. Senior domestic staff members were summoned back from their vacations. The apparatus of crisis management, which had lain dormant for months, roared back into existence with a terrifying velocity. At Windsor Castle, the environment was even more fraught with tension. Personnel who had reported for standard shifts found themselves reassigned. Hallways were emptied, and private chambers were secured. Princess Anne had reached the location 30 minutes prior. her features fixed in the stoic expression she adopted during the most arduous tribulations. Queen Camilla remained sequestered inside the private residence, and those who caught a fleeting glimpse of her reported that she appeared to have aged a decade in a single night. Yet, the most definitive indicator of catastrophe was found in the absolute void of information. There was no official declaration, no meticulously drafted health bulletin, no calming press release, only a silence that was heavy and foreboding, descending upon the monarchy like snow preceding a blizzard. And within that stillness, one reality became undeniable. Whatever intelligence was racing toward them, it was destined to alter absolutely everything. The hours preceding that morning had initiated normally enough, which somehow rendered what ensued even more surreal, even more impossible to square with the disaster that would materialize by noon. William had awakened at 6:30, his customary hour, to the noise of his alarm and the muffled sounds of his offspring already waking in their bedrooms down the corridor. He had partaken in breakfast with Catherine and the children in the cozy kitchen at Kensington Palace, conversing about George's impending examinations and Charlotte's piano performance. These were the mundane trivialities of domestic life that offered an anchor and a sense of normalcy amidst the extraordinary burden of royal obligation. Louis had overturned juice onto the table. Charlotte had grumbled regarding her mathematics assignment, and George had inquired, as he did on most mornings, whether he might be permitted to skip his French tutorial. It was ordinary, beautifully, heartbreakingly ordinary. By 8:15, William was situated in his office, examining the daily agenda with his private secretary. There was a veterans' charity gathering at 10 o'clock, a luncheon with advisors to deliberate on the spring tour of Australia, logistics to finalize, security protocols to review, and afternoon calls with constitutional scholars regarding parliamentary processes and some obscure issue involving the Privy Council. It was nothing extraordinary, nothing to intimate that this day would evolve into one he would never forget, one that would demarcate his life into a clear before and after. His private secretary had even quipped about the light schedule, proposing with a grin that they might conclude early enough for William to observe George's football training at 4. William had chuckled, appreciative of the potential for normalcy, of being merely a father applauding from the sidelines rather than a prince navigating impossible standards. But around 9:30, the initial irregular signal materialized. It was subtle but undeniable to anyone who grasped the meticulous cadences of royal correspondence. A text communiqué from Anne arrived, concise and enigmatic, in a manner that instantaneously triggered internal warning sirens. "Have you conversed with father this morning?" William furrowed his brow, gazing intensely at the display. Anne seldom utilized text messages, favoring telephone calls or in-person dialogues where inflection and context could not be misconstrued. The phrasing felt peculiar, cautious, as if she were probing whether he possessed knowledge she could not explicitly state. It was some piece of data she needed to verify that he either held or lacked. He responded that he had not spoken to Charles since their brief interaction the previous evening, when his father had appeared fatigued but otherwise well. Anne's rejoinder was even more disquieting, arriving almost instantaneously. "Contact me when you are able, privately." William attempted to reach her immediately, tapping her contact information with fingers that had already started to feel chilled despite the heating in his office. The call diverted to voicemail. He attempted again 10 minutes subsequently, and then 15 minutes following that. The outcome was identical. Her voice politely requested him to leave a message, a recording that felt increasingly insufficient as his anxiety mounted. That was the moment the apprehension began to take root in his chest. It was a tightness he could not fully articulate or brush aside. It was a sensation he had learned over the years never to disregard. Anne invariably answered, always. Her telephone was an extension of her obligation, and duty for Anne was sacred and absolute, something she would never jeopardize without an extraordinary cause. Catherine observed the alteration in his demeanor around Tenhode. She noted the way his attention had turned inward, his focus narrowing to something she could not perceive but clearly sensed. "Is everything satisfactory?" she inquired, hesitating in the threshold of his office, her voice bearing that specific note of worry she saved for moments when she intuited something was amiss beneath the facade. William raised his eyes from his phone, where he had been staring at Anne's unanswered summons, the screen now blackened but still commanding his focus. "Probable?" he uttered, though his inflection suggested the contrary, betraying the falsehood even as he voiced it. "I simply cannot contact Anne. It is peculiar." Catherine possessed enough wisdom not to discount his instincts. After years in partnership, after observing him navigate innumerable crises and complexities, she had come to understand that William's intuition regarding when matters were awry seldom failed him. By 10:30, additional fragments of the puzzle surfaced, though none of them aligned logically yet. None of them constructed a coherent image he could decipher. William's equerry noted in passing that the king's morning agenda had been abruptly purged, all appointments rescinded without justification or the customary diplomatic reorganization that accompanied standard changes. The official narrative was a routine adjustment, but staff who had been preparing for a planned investiture ceremony, arranging medals and printing programs, found themselves relieved of duty with barely an hour's warning. Then came the intelligence that Camilla had cancelled her public appearance at a London infirmary, citing a personal issue. That specific detail struck with more force than the others. Camilla never cancelled. Never. She took pride in her dependability, in appearing regardless of the conditions, in sustaining the steady presence the populace anticipated. William attempted to call his father directly, dialing the private line that circumvented all standard palace protocols. The connection rang 3 times before engaging, but rather than Charles's voice, he heard the remorseful tone of his father's private secretary. He explained that His Majesty was occupied in meetings and would return the correspondence shortly. However, something in the secretary's vocal quality felt rehearsed, scripted, as if he were adhering to directives to deflect rather than inform, to uphold a fiction that was already disintegrating. William terminated the call feeling significantly more disturbed than before, his anxiety now hardening into something approaching dread. At 11:00, William was scheduled to be at his veterans meeting, shaking hands and listening to narratives from men and women who had served. Instead, he sat at his desk gazing at his telephone, waiting for a clarity that refused to arrive. He waited for someone to call and clarify that everything was well, that he had been worrying over nothing. Catherine brought him tea, placing it gently beside the documents he had ceased reading 20 minutes prior. "William," she uttered softly, her hand resting momentarily on his shoulder, "whatever the issue is, we will manage it." He nodded, but the reassurance felt vacuous and insufficient. Certain things could not simply be managed. Some things could only be endured. Then, at 11:17, his phone rang with that distinctive tone. It was the one reserved for only the most critical palace communications. It was the signal that meant someone at the paramount level of palace operations needed to reach him instantly. It was the one that bypassed all standard protocols and announced, before a single word was uttered, that something had gone catastrophically wrong. William answered on the first ring, and Sir Clive Alderton's voice, strained and urgent in ways William had never heard before, delivered words that would replay in William's mind for years to come. These were words that would mark the precise instant his life altered forever. The drive to Windsor felt interminable despite the velocity. Despite the reality that William's protection officer was driving well beyond standard limits, treating vacant highway lanes as if they existed exclusively for this emergency, the journey dragged. William sat in the rear seat, silent and rigid, staring through tinted glass at a countryside that blurred past in streaks of winter brown and gray. His protection officer, a man named Thomas, who had served him for 8 years and seen him through countless arduous moments from family crises to security threats, knew better than to attempt dialogue. Some silences demand reverence, and this one felt almost sacred in its gravity. When the vehicle finally passed through Windsor's gates, William noticed immediately how altered everything felt. He noted how the familiar landscape of the castle grounds had transformed into something foreign and foreboding. Staff stood in irregular positions, clustered in doorways, rather than moving through their standard routines. Security had been doubled, perhaps tripled, with additional officers stationed at every ingress. And the main entrance, typically bustling with the routine activity of a working palace, was sealed except for essential personnel, cordoned off as if preparing for a siege rather than governance. He was directed not to the main reception halls where official business normally occurred, but to a private wing used only for the most sensitive family matters. It was a place for conversations that could not risk even the slightest possibility of being overheard. Anne was waiting in the hallway outside the king's private study, standing perfectly immobile in a manner that somehow communicated more tension than any pacing could have achieved. She stood with her arms crossed, her face grave but composed in that way she had perfected over decades of navigating royal crises, of being the steady hand when everyone else faltered. When she saw William approaching, something in her expression shifted subtly. It was not quite sympathy, but rather acknowledgement. She knew what he was about to learn, and she knew it would wound him in ways that would reshape him. "How severe?" William asked, his voice low, almost fearful of the answer but needing it nonetheless. Anne didn't soften it. She never did. "Worse than we thought possible." Inside the study, Charles sat in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, though no fire burned despite the December chill that had settled into the room's corners. The chamber felt cold, sterile, and wrong in ways William couldn't immediately articulate. Camilla stood behind him, one hand resting on his shoulder in a gesture that seemed both protective and desperately clinging. Her eyes were red-rimmed but dry, as if she had already exhausted her capacity for tears. And on the desk, carefully arranged as if presentation could somehow lessen the impact, were medical reports with official letterheads, legal documents bearing government seals, and a single handwritten letter in Charles's distinctive script. The fountain pen he favored was visible beside it. Sir Clive Alderton, along with the king's senior physician and 2 constitutional advisers, William recognized from previous sensitive meetings, stood near the windows. Their faces carried the weight of men who had delivered unbearable news and were now waiting to deliver it again. They were waiting to watch another person absorb what they had already processed. William entered slowly, his feet feeling heavy against the carpet. Every instinct was screaming that whatever came next would be worse than anything his imagination had conjured during the interminable drive. Charles looked up, and William saw immediately what he had been trying desperately not to see during the journey. His father looked diminished, smaller somehow, as though the news he carried had physically shrunk him, hollowing him out from the inside. "William," Charles said, his voice rougher than usual, scratched and worn. "Sit down, please." William remained standing, his body refusing the comfort of sitting, as if remaining upright could somehow maintain control over a situation that was clearly spiraling beyond anyone's command. "Just tell me," he said, the words coming out more forcefully than he had intended. The king's physician stepped forward, holding a file that seemed too thin to contain something catastrophic. It looked too ordinary to hold the weight William could already feel pressing against his chest. But catastrophes, William was learning in real time, often arrive in deceptively small packages. They arrive in manila folders and quiet rooms, rather than dramatic announcements. The physician spoke in clinical terms first. It was the language of medicine providing temporary shelter from emotional devastation. It acted as a buffer between reality and feeling. Progression has advanced. Complications were unforeseen. Options for remediation are depleted. The time frame has been drastically abbreviated. These were words that danced around the truth, while simultaneously containing nothing but the truth. William heard the words and processed their technical meaning through the fog that was settling over his mind. But his mind refused to accept the conclusion. They led toward the inevitable end point that loomed like a cliff edge. "How long?" he asked, cutting through the medical terminology. He demanded the one piece of information that mattered, the one fact that would define everything that followed. The physician exchanged glances with Sir Clive, a silent communication that William recognized as the moment before unbearable news. Weeks, perhaps months, if we are fortunate, but not years, not anymore. The room seemed to tilt, the floor shifting beneath William's feet, as if the earth itself was rejecting this information. William gripped the edge of a nearby chair, steadying himself against news that felt physically crushing. It seemed to carry actual weight, pressing down on his shoulders, his chest, and his entire body. His father, the king who had waited a lifetime to wear the crown, who had only just begun the reign he had spent decades preparing for, who had finally achieved the role he had been born to fulfill, was dying. It was not in some distant, theoretical future that could be pushed aside and ignored. It was soon, irreversibly, devastatingly soon. Charles spoke then, his voice carrying a strange calm that William recognized as the composure of someone who had already processed shock and moved into acceptance. It was the voice of someone who had lived with this knowledge long enough to find some measure of peace with it. "I have known for 3 days," he said quietly, each word carefully measured. "I needed time to understand it myself before telling anyone else. I'm sorry you had to wait for the truth." William wanted to be angry about the delay. He wanted to rage against the unfairness of timing and circumstance, against the cruelty of being kept in the dark while his father carried this alone. But looking at his father now, seeing the exhaustion and resignation in his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly where they rested on the chair arms, anger felt impossible. It felt inappropriate, beside the point. "Does anyone else know?" he managed to ask, his voice sounding distant and strange in his own ears. "Anne, Camilla, the medical team, and constitutional advisors who needed to begin preparations." Charles paused, choosing his next words carefully, his gaze never leaving William's face. "And now you, because what comes next will fall to you far sooner than any of us imagined." The hours following that initial devastating conversation moved with a strange, disjointed quality. Time itself seemed to have become unreliable, stretching some moments into unbearable length while compressing others into a meaningless blur. William remained at Windsor, unable to process what leaving would mean. He could not comprehend what returning to normalcy would require when normal no longer existed, when the entire framework of his life had been fundamentally altered in the space of a single conversation. Catherine arrived by early afternoon, having arranged for the children to stay with trusted staff at Kensington Palace. They were protected for now from the knowledge that would soon reshape their world as well. She found William in one of the smaller sitting rooms, staring at nothing. He looked lost in ways she had never seen before, not even during the darkest moments after his grandmother's death. She sat beside him without speaking, her presence offering the only comfort possible in a moment when comfort felt inadequate. It was a time when words seemed to fall short of the enormity of what they were facing. After several minutes of silence that felt both endless and too brief, William finally spoke. "I am not ready." 3 words, barely whispered, yet they carried the weight of everything he had been holding back since leaving his father's study. "I am not ready to be king. Not like this, not now, not when it means losing him." Catherine took his hand, squeezing gently, her thumb tracing circles across his knuckles in a gesture she had repeated countless times over the years they had been together. "No one is ever ready for this," she said, her voice steady, anchoring the calm he desperately needed in the chaos swirling through his mind. "But you will do it anyway, because that is what you were born to do. Because you are his son, and because you have no choice," her voice softened. "And you will not do it alone, not for a single moment." Throughout the afternoon, the palace transformed into a command center managing a crisis that could not yet be made public. It required absolute secrecy, even as dozens of people scrambled to prepare for what was coming. Constitutional experts gathered in secure rooms, reviewing protocols for succession that had not been implemented since 1952. They examined regency options and studied the complex legal mechanisms that govern the transfer of power from one monarch to another. Some of these procedures had not been seriously examined in decades. Their language was antiquated, their assumptions rooted in a world that no longer existed. Dust was being blown off documents that most had hoped would remain theoretical for decades longer. These were plans that should have stayed safely hypothetical until William was older, more experienced, and more prepared. Princess Anne moved through Windsor with her characteristic efficiency, making decisions that others were too paralyzed to make. She acted where others were too overwhelmed by emotion to approach with clear thinking. She coordinated with the Prime Minister's office through secure channels, ensuring government was prepared for what was coming. She ensured that the machinery of state would not falter during the transition. She reviewed security protocols with military advisors, understanding instinctively that threats always multiply during periods of vulnerability. She knew that enemies, both foreign and domestic, would see opportunity in royal tragedy, and she handled the delicate task of beginning to inform extended family members. She made calls to relatives across Britain and Europe, delivering news that would ripple through the entire royal structure like shock waves from an earthquake's epicenter. Camilla, meanwhile, remained closest to Charles. Her world was narrowing to the man whose time was being measured now not in years or even months, but in diminishing increments of weeks and days. Staff reported that she barely left his side, eating meals with him even when he could not eat. She forced herself to maintain normalcy even as everything crumbled. She sat in rooms reading even when he slept, maintaining presence as if proximity could somehow slow what was inevitable. It was as if love alone could hold back mortality. She had fought so hard to stand beside him as queen. She had weathered decades of criticism, scandal, and public hatred to reach this position. And now that position was being torn away before she had barely begun to inhabit it. It was happening before they had had any real time together in the roles they had waited so long to fill. The most painful aspect, the one that threatened to break William entirely, was the children. He and Catherine faced the impossible task of deciding when and how to tell George, Charlotte, and Louis that their grandfather was dying. They adored him, and he told them stories, played games, and made them laugh. George, at 11, would understand the permanence. He would grasp that death meant forever, and would carry this loss into his own future as king. Charlotte would grasp enough to be devastated, her sensitive nature making her particularly vulnerable to grief. Louis might be too young to fully comprehend, which carried its own heartbreak. It was the knowledge that he would lose these precious years with his grandfather without fully understanding what was being taken from him. They decided to wait, giving themselves time to find words adequate for explaining the inexplicable. They needed to make sense of something that defied sense. By evening, exhaustion had settled over everyone involved. It was a bone-deep weariness that went beyond mere physical tiredness. William stood at a window overlooking the grounds, watching darkness swallow the landscape. The winter night arrived early and absolute. Anne found him there, standing in silence for a long moment before speaking. She respected the quiet before breaking it. "You are thinking about all the things you will never get to ask him," she said. It was not a question, but a statement of understanding born from her own experience with loss. William nodded, not trusting his voice initially. When he finally spoke, the words came thick with emotion. "There is so much I still needed to learn about being king, about managing this life, about carrying this burden without losing yourself." He turned to face her, and in his eyes she saw not the future king, but the frightened son. "He waited so long for this. It is not fair. None of this is fair." Anne's response was characteristically direct. It was honest in ways that others might have considered cruel, but that William needed to hear. Fairness has nothing to do with monarchy. It never has. But then her voice softened slightly, revealing the emotion she usually kept carefully hidden. "But you are right. He deserved more time. We all did. And I am sorry you are being asked to face this now." The following morning brought new crises layered atop existing devastation. William was summoned to an emergency meeting in the secure conference room where constitutional advisors, legal experts, and senior palace officials had been working through the night. The exhaustion showed on their faces, but their purpose was urgent and unavoidable. Decisions had to be made, and they had to be made now. Sir Clive Alderton opened the discussion with characteristic directness. "Your Royal Highness, we need to address several immediate questions regarding succession procedures and public announcement protocols. The situation requires decisions that only you and His Majesty can authorize." William sat at the head of the table, a position that felt simultaneously premature and inevitable. "What are the options?" His voice was steady, though his hands remained clasped tightly beneath the table, hidden from view. The constitutional secretary, a woman who had served the crown for 40 years, spoke next. "The first question is timing. When do we inform the public about His Majesty's prognosis?" She slid a document across the table. "We have 3 primary scenarios outlined, each with different implications. Option 1 was immediate public announcement with full transparency, acknowledging the king's terminal diagnosis and limited time frame. The advantage was honesty, preventing the corrosive effect of rumors and speculation. The disadvantage was panic. Markets would react, and international relations would destabilize. The nation, having barely adjusted to Charles's reign, would face immediate preparation for another transition. Option 2 was gradual disclosure. Begin with general health concerns, allow the public to adjust, then provide updates as the situation progressed. This approach offered time for collective processing, but risked accusations of deception when the full truth eventually emerged, and the truth always emerged. Option 3 was minimal disclosure until absolutely necessary. Maintain privacy, adjust schedules quietly, and only announce the severity when death was imminent. This protected the king's dignity and the family's grief, but violated the public trust at a moment when trust was essential. William stared at the options, each one representing a different kind of failure. "What does my father want?" he asked quietly. Anne, who had been present throughout the night's deliberations, answered, "He wants to protect you from having to make this choice, but that is impossible now. The choice exists, and someone must make it." The military secretary added another complication. "There are also security considerations, Your Royal Highness. Once the severity becomes public knowledge, threat levels increase. We will need to enhance protection for all senior royals, particularly yourself and your family." Succession always attracts instability. William felt the weight pressing down, the responsibility that had always been abstract, becoming crushingly concrete. He thought about his children, about the life they had known being shattered. He thought about Catherine, who would become queen consort years before they had planned. He thought about his father, robbed of the reign he had waited for, and he thought about himself, about to inherit a throne in the worst possible circumstances. "I need to speak with my father," William said finally. "Before any decisions are made, I need to hear directly from him what he wants. Not what is constitutional, not what is traditional, but what he wants." The meeting paused. While William was escorted to Charles's private rooms, he found his father sitting in his study, papers spread before him, still trying to work, even as his body failed him. It was so perfectly, heartbreakingly characteristic that William had to pause in the doorway, steadying himself. Charles looked up and managed a weak smile. "They have presented you with impossible choices, haven't they?" He gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "Sit. Let us talk as father and son, not as king and heir." What followed was a conversation William would carry with him forever. Charles spoke about his fears, his regrets, and the things he wished he had accomplished, and now never would. But more importantly, he spoke about William. He spoke about his confidence in his son's readiness, his pride in the man William had become, and his certainty that the crown would be safe in his hands. "I want you to announce it," Charles said finally. "Not immediately, but soon, within the week. The public deserves truth, and I deserve to spend my remaining time without the burden of pretending." His voice grew firmer. "And you deserve time to prepare, to transition, to step into this role with dignity rather than chaos." William's throat tightened. "I do not know if I can do this." Charles reached across the desk, taking his son's hand. "You can, you will, because you are my son, and you were born for this moment, even though neither of us wanted it to come so soon." When William returned to the conference room, his decision was made. They would announce within 3 days, allowing time to prepare the family, coordinate with the government, and draft a statement that balanced honesty with dignity. The impossible choice had been made, and now they would face its consequences together. The announcement came on a gray Monday morning, 3 days after William received the devastating news. At 800 precisely, Buckingham Palace released a statement that would dominate headlines across the world for weeks to come. "His Majesty the King has been informed by his medical team that his condition has progressed more rapidly than anticipated. Treatment options have been exhausted. The King and his family are grateful for the support of the public during this difficult time." The words were carefully chosen, clinical yet clear. No false hope, no dramatic language, just the truth delivered with the dignity the moment required. But the impact was anything but clinical. Within minutes, the world stopped. Trading floors fell silent. Television programs were interrupted, and social media exploded with grief, shock, and an outpouring of support that crossed national boundaries and political divides. In Britain, the reaction was particularly intense among older viewers who had watched Charles wait his entire life to be king. There was something uniquely cruel about his reign being cut short so dramatically, so quickly. Vigils began forming outside Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle by mid-morning. People gathered not to protest or demand, but simply to stand together in shared grief. American networks devoted entire days to coverage, with experts analyzing everything from constitutional implications to the emotional toll on the family. CBS ran a special segment on William's sudden burden, interviewing psychologists about the trauma of preparing to lose a parent while simultaneously preparing to inherit unimaginable responsibility. CNN brought in historians to discuss previous short reigns and sudden successions, searching for precedents that might offer comfort or context. Inside Kensington Palace, William and Catherine faced their own private aftermath. They told the children that same Monday evening, gathering them in the sitting room and explaining as gently as possible that Grandpa was very sick and would not get better. George understood immediately, his face crumpling before he turned away to hide tears. Charlotte cried openly, asking questions that had no good answers. Louis, confused but sensing the grief around him, simply climbed into Catherine's lap and stayed there. At Windsor, Charles experienced the strange phenomenon of living through his own eulogy. Tributes poured in from world leaders, celebrities, and ordinary citizens. Television programs began running retrospectives of his life, his advocacy for environmental causes, and his decades of public service. He watched some of it with Camilla, finding the experience surreal and unexpectedly moving. Princess Anne threw herself into logistics because logistics were controllable when emotions were not. She coordinated with funeral directors, reviewed ceremonial protocols, and ensured every detail of what would come next was planned and prepared. When colleagues suggested she slow down and rest, she responded with characteristic bluntness. "There will be time for grief after. Right now, there is work." The most profound change settled over William himself. In the weeks following the announcement, he transformed before the eyes of those closest to him. The weight he carried became visible in his posture, his expressions, and the way he moved through rooms as though the air itself had grown heavier. He took meetings with constitutional advisors, reviewed documents about succession, and studied protocols he had been avoiding thinking about for years. The abstract future had become the immediate present. But amid the preparation and grief, there were also moments of grace. Charles, freed from the burden of secrecy, spent his remaining strength with family. There were long conversations with William about kingship and fatherhood. There were quiet afternoons with Camilla, reading together in silence. There were video calls with George, Charlotte, and Louis, where he told them stories and made them laugh even as he grew visibly weaker. As December deepened toward Christmas, the monarchy existed in a state of suspended time. Everyone knew what was coming, but the knowledge did not make it easier. William found himself waking in the middle of the night, thinking about all the things he still wanted to ask his father, all the guidance he still needed, and all the time they would not have. Catherine found him one such night, standing at a window watching snow fall over Kensington Gardens. She did not say anything, just stood beside him, her hand finding his. Sometimes there were no words adequate for the moment. Sometimes presence was all that could be offered. And in that silence, as snow continued to fall and the city slept, William understood that this was what kingship truly meant. Not the ceremonies or the crown or the constitutional authority, but this, standing in the darkness, carrying impossible weight. It was knowing that tomorrow would demand everything from you and choosing to face it anyway. Duty, family, and love required nothing less. The crown does not wait for readiness. It does not pause for grief or adjust for circumstance. It simply passes, as it has for centuries, from one generation to the next. And William, son and heir, stands now at the threshold between what was and what must be. He is carrying his father's legacy forward into a future neither of them wanted, but both must face. From which country are you watching this unfold? Your perspective adds meaning to how this story resonates across the world. Thank you for bearing witness to this moment with me.